I'm Terry Agler. If some of you might know my dad, Tom Agler, if you're from the Geneva area, coach and history teacher. So I'm going to get a couple of announcements out of the way. And Hartford, I know. Some of the pictures you're seeing, a lot of those are on a Facebook page that is called If You Might Be Interested If You're from Geneva. If you haven't joined it, the administrator is sitting right over here, and he will approve you to be on it. A lot of these pictures came from there. A lot of the pictures, there are pictures up here with the newspaper clippings that are not on there. I made them bigger so you can read them easily. We also have a reprint of the 72 Centennial book for sale for $5 and the new Sesquicentennial coin. So if you got the Centennial, you got to get the Sesquicentennial. Or if you're like me, when it happened, I was in the 8th grade, I didn't get either one. So, I know. Immediately following this, Rich is going to do a talk, and then he's going to do some questions and answers at the end if anybody has a question about the Geneva area that you're dying to know. And then at 5 is the opening ceremonies. So you can leave here, or you can look. It's nice and air conditioned in here. You can grab something to eat because they are supposed to be open at 4 o'clock. So while we were up here doing this, they should be finishing setting up eating. And then you can go to the open ceremonies, which is right next door. Okay? So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Rich Briggs, which everybody here probably knows. So, and it's all fixed. It's all fixed. All right.
There are a lot of familiar faces out there. I can tell how long somebody's known me just by walking down the street of Geneva, how they greet me. When I was younger, people like Tate Fields and Pete Reicheldifer, I was referred to as young Richard Briggs because my uncle was old Richard Briggs. Everybody I went to school with, I think Neil and Denny, the other guys, I was Richie Briggs because Uncle Rich was Rich Briggs, as Ina called him, Richard. And once I got in the bank, I was Mr. Briggs. I was never Mr. Briggs. I was his dad. And my dad, he was always Jimmy because my grandfather was Jim. I'll tell you a story. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to be kind of rambling. You know, I've got a few points I'm going to touch on. But I'm going to ramble with stories about being around. My Uncle Rich died in 1972, and I was working a construction job during the summer between college up in Elkhart, Indiana for Amos Schwartz. And came back for the funeral, and we had the funeral at Hardee's. And we get outside, and I was a pallbearer. All 4 of us boys, and then the 2 coon boys, Don and Tom. Well, Cedric, we put Uncle Rich in the hearse, and Cedric looks at it and says, "All right, who's driving?" We didn't know we had to drive the hearse, so everybody, you know. So the minister and I, Ray Bachman, who was doing it, we flipped a coin kind of, and I drove the hearse. So I'm driving my Uncle Rich out to the graveyard at Riverside. We get out there, have a nice service, and we're getting ready to leave. And my Aunt Ina comes up, and she was just devastated when Rich died. She says, "Oh, Richard," she says, "would you please stay in the graveyard and make sure they get Rich covered correctly?" You know, she said, I worry about that. Okay, well, I give the keys to the minister. He takes off. So I'm stuck out there, and Dad realizes that I'm going to have to walk back to Geneva because all the other cars are gone. So he sent Mom and Ina with I think my brother John back into town because they were having coffee and stuff in the house. So Dad and I are sitting out. And if you've ever been to Riverside, there's a big tombstone that says Briggs on it. And we're sitting on top of the tombstone watching Kenny Noble cover Uncle Rich. And of course my grandmother comes out and she's mad because Uncle Rich is buried beside his parents, and the crypt that they had for them, she said, that was guaranteed. It was never going to leak. And there's water gushing in and out. She said, we're going to have that fixed. And Dad's going, no, I don't think we're going to get it fixed. I don't think it matters anymore, Mom. So finally so Dad and I, like I said, are sitting on the tombstone, and he said, look, he says, we're gonna take care of the hardware store. He says, would you come back and run it till school starts, which would be about 6 weeks? Sure, you know, no problem. So I came in, and the first week after the funeral, we went in and inventory. I found stuff that my great-grandfather had marked in 1890. And Rich just had it on a shelf and never moved it. You know, coffee grinders, things like that. So we inventoried for a week. Monday morning, we didn't tell anybody we were opening. They gave me the keys and a bag with $50 in it for change, and sent me into the hardware store and said, if anything happens, call Ina, she'll tell you where it is. Okay, so I'm in there, and nothing's going on. You know, I'm walking around, I'm familiarizing myself with everything. The phone rings, and I go over and I answer it. Briggs Hardware. And this voice on the other end goes, who am I speaking to? And I said, Rich Briggs. He says, you're a damn liar, he's dead. And I said, no, I'm his nephew. He says, oh, Richie, what are you doing there? I said, well, I'm running it. It's Bruce Schlagenhoff, so I've known all my life. And I will tell, I've had people call me. I've had a guy in South Bend, Indiana called me. Said, are you telling a Bruce Schlagenhoff story when you do this? I said, yes, I will tell a Bruce Schlagenhoff story. I know it's going to tick Chubb off. I hope it doesn't make her too mad. I hope Harold doesn't get mad. But if I don't tell a Bruce Schlagenhoff story, I think there are going to be a lot of disappointed people. So Bruce is looking for something. So, but that's it. When I come here, you know, I'm Rich. Now, my family, and I think the only reason I'm doing this is that I know this stuff is that my family moved here. The town was founded in 1872. My family moved here in 1870, the fall of. My great-great-grandfather, William Henry Harrison Briggs, and his 4 children, he had a child while they were here, was a carpenter. They lived in Salina, Ohio. And they were contracted by the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad to build a wooden bridge which is across the Wabash. Then another bridge which is on the south end of town, near where Red Gold is, and then the train station. And there were a lot of carpenters on the job. So in 1871, they were here for the winter, then they started in 1871. When it came time to leave or whatever, Mr. Studebaker and some of his friends had platted, they bought all the land between Buffalo and Sealand and had laid out his town. And everybody says that, you know, Sealand was very upset. They thought they were getting the train station. And it was very important that you had the train station. Buffalo also thought they were getting it. Mr. Studebaker, I think, bribed the railroad to put it in between the two because he owned all the land there. The second lot that was sold was to William Henry Harrison Briggs and his wife, Catherine. They built a house on where, everybody knows what the big brick house is, right? Yeah, okay. That's not the first house there. The first house there is the one that's on Butcher Street, where my brother John, where Uncle Rich and I lived, and that was the first house they built in Geneva. That sat there. Then when Rich and Ina got married, well, just before they moved it over there when they built the brick house. And that's where my grandfather and Uncle Rich lived when they were kids. We've been here. I'm the 5th generation of my family here. Hate to say it, but I'm probably the last generation of my family here. But the only reason I know this stuff, or that I have interested, we grew up here, like a lot of you people. I mean, Geneva's our home. But I digress. Okay, so they built the train station here, and the town took off. It did pretty well. First there was lumber south of here, white oaks and things like that. And they shipped them out on the train. Then they discovered oil, and things just took off like crazy. I mean, this was an oil boom town. and grew tremendously. My grandfather, Bill Hoskinson, that was my grandmother Mary's father, he started working for Standard Oil at the age of 12, driving a team of horses carrying wood and pipes to oil wells. He later on got a job with them. He had probably the most dangerous job I've ever heard, working for an oil company. He would go out, and they had pipelines that they piped the oil with, and he would go out, and he had a stick that was about this long and had a copper cup on the end of it and a thermometer that went up to the top, and he would go out and open the pipelines and stick the thermometer in and take the temperature of the oil, and the warmer it was, the better it flowed, so he would have to check that. Well, it doesn't sound dangerous, but you got to remember that this is a wilderness around here, and snakes like warm things. So he would go out, especially in the fall and spring when it was kind of cold, and there'd be a timber rattler sitting on top of the pipe. That didn't bother him so much because he could see those. What bothered him was the pipes on the ground, the snakes would lay across them and warm up that way. Now, if you knew my grandmother, she never threw anything away. We still have the stick with the cup at her. But he walked out and he had, I have to wear this brace because it hurt my leg. He wore snake gaiters. They were made out of leather and wood and had these big long leather gloves that he would take out with him in case the snakes would. There were fang marks on those things where the snakes would hit at him, and he would just keep going. So, what do you do about the snakes on top? It's not, I just brush them off, There's the ones laying on the ground that he was worried about. So, but he worked for Standard Oil. And eventually, a lot of people came to Geneva, including Charles Porter. Charles Porter was Gene Stratton Porter's husband. And let's face it, everything about the sesquicentennials, she is kind of the main focus of it because she is probably the most famous person that ever came out of Geneva, and rightly so. But her husband, Charles, was an incredible human being. He ran a pharmacy, and in that pharmacy, there wasn't any bank in town. Excuse me. He would, the guys would get paid for working. They didn't want to walk around with all their money in their pocket, so he would let them put it on deposit in his vault, in the safe in his pharmacy. And he kept doing that for years. That developed into the Bank of Geneva. He founded the Bank of Geneva. He was also a land developer. He developed real estate around here. You could walk into Porter's drugstore and buy a steamship ticket that would take you from New York to Europe. He was a steamship. He had that. He was incredible. When Mrs. Porter left in 1916 or something, I forget, and moved to California. First, she went up to Rome City. Yeah. And you can't tell me, this ticks me off, they actually named a creek up there the Limberlost. The Limberlost is over there, it's not up in Rome City anymore. I'm sorry. But she moved up there, they built that cabin. He treated it as a summer cabin, she lived there. Then she went to California where she got killed. He never left Adams County. When they sold the cabin to Dr. Price and his wife, he moved up to Decatur to the hotel up there that's catty corner to this courthouse there. And he had a chauffeur in a car, and he would ride to Geneva every day with the chauffeur to conduct his business down here and then ride back. She died in 1923, he died in 1926. He's buried in the Decatur Cemetery up by the golf course. Not the Catholic one, the one on the south side, the Protestant one. And it's kind of funny, when she died, she was killed in a car wreck. And if you go out to Hollywood, there's a place called the Hollywood Cemetery. Big development, it's kind of ratty now. But they wanted Mrs. Porter to be buried there because she was so famous. So they put a Gene Stratton Porter terrace. And it's got the name on it. And they're going to build this big mausoleum-like thing and put her in there. Well, something happened, and about 7 or 8 years after she died, this is in one of the books that they wrote about her, they were cleaning out a storage room at the thing, and they found her casket with her still in it, and they just stuck it in there and hadn't buried her yet. So Mr. Porter was buried, and then she and her daughter Jeanette were buried out there, and then later on Indiana moved her up there. But Mr. Porter is still here in Adams County, I think, where he'd rather be anyway. Another guy, and this is I'm correcting something that didn't happen this centennial. I didn't realize it until Terry told me that there's a guy that was in town named Bob Judy. Do you guys remember Bob Judy's picture in the gym? Yeah. Bob Judy is the only Olympic athlete out of Adams County ever. He qualified for the 1924 Olympics. The 1924 Olympics, have you ever seen the movies Chariots of Fire? That is the 1924 Olympics, and Bob Judy was there. Not Bob Judy, Bob Judy.
If you ever had Harold Holmes for a teacher.
Oh, did I?
That story at least 12 times.
Oh, yeah. And, I mean, Bob, his medals are sitting down the hallway there in the reading room. And I don't know why they totally forgot, but he was, he was the national high jump champion in 1924. He was an incredible athlete. His nephew, Steve Jude, played football for Michigan State. He was Bob's brother, and Bob's brother married Alfie Chu's daughter. I mean, people remember Alfie Chu? Okay, yeah. And they moved up to Flint, Michigan, and then Steve, he was the quarterback of the 1964-65 Michigan State football team that was rated #1 and played the famous tie game with Notre Dame. And then his sons wanted to play Major League Baseball. Very athletic then. But Bob Judy was left out of the Sesquicentennial. And I don't know why he should have been in there. I mean, we used to walk in the gym, and there's this huge picture of Bob Judy hanging in the gym. And that picture's disappeared too. I wish I knew. I know what happened to the Geneva trophies, and I think the same thing happened to Bob's photo. And somebody saved the trophies, but nobody saved Bob's thing, maybe. But he was a great athlete. Another guy. We're in the building. When I was a kid growing up, this was Hardy Furniture downstairs. Cedric and Lillian Hardy. Up here, this was the Oddfellows Hall. They had a pool table, and you could come and play pool. But Cedric Hardy was a remarkable human being. Great woodworker. If you go to the Methodist Church, he did a lot of the trim and stuff in the sanctuary. He built. There used to be he built the pulpit. He built the rail that was in front of the choir loft. All sorts of things. Just great woodworker. Very intelligent man. There, my brother John. And Cedric is a direct descendant of Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin's son, William, was the royal governor of New Jersey. And when he was a younger man, he had an affair with a maid who worked in the Franklin house, and they had a son. Well, Benjamin adopted this grandson, and that's Cedric's great-great-grandfather. Yeah. And this kid, if you saw the PBS special about Franklin that was on this year, they talk about this kid extensively, because every time Benjamin Franklin took a trip to Europe or to England, when he was raising money for the Revolution, that kid went with him as his secretary. Cedric Hardy, the undertaker here in town, was the direct descendant of that kid. That's what's so kind of fun doing things about this. You can find out all this history about people that you just didn't know. Another one, this used to tick Ittle off. How many people know what Ittle Buckingham's real first name is? Clarence. There are people that lived and died in Geneva and thought his real name was Ittle. Tate Fields gave him the nickname because Ittle's brother Earl was called Big Buck, and Clarence was Little Buck. And Tate couldn't say L's real well because he became Ittlebuck. But Ittle was a great athlete, and had a beautiful singing voice. And back in the 30s, late 20s, 30s, the Star Theater down here, the guy that ran it was a guy named Maxwell. And he would put on talent shows, and It'll would sing there, and usually It'll won. But one time, Mr. Maxwell brought his sister down, Marvel Maxwell, and she beat It'll, who caused him a dump. Well, Marvel Maxwell went to Hollywood, and Marvel Maxwell became Marilyn Maxwell, who was a major star in the 40s and 50s. In fact, at Christmas time, watch Turner Classic Movies, and if they do have the Lemon Drop Kid song Silver Bells that Bob Hope and her sing, they introduced that and won the Academy Award for Best Song. But she used to come down here to Geneva and play with all the kids while her brother ran the store. But It'll was so ticked because I think first prize was $1, and in 1930, $1, with the Depression, that was an awful lot of money, and she beat It'll out. So poor It'll. I was going to tell the story, but It'll was a really good baseball player in that, and I love telling this story. My Uncle Billy used to tell it. They were playing basketball, and the old gyms used to be, real tight, small and everything. They used to have wood-burning stoves and stuff in the corner, so Well, they were playing, in basketball back then, they had center jumps. After you made a basket or something, you had a center jump and you start over. And if you had a big, tall guy on your team, you could keep the ball pretty much all the time. Well, they're playing this game, and they're doing a center jump, and It'll anticipated the jump and darted in front of the guy who was supposed to get the ball and stole it. So It'll is charging down the court, dribbling, and I think it was Martha Spiker. Martha was about this tall, about this wide, tiny little girl, but she was a cheerleader. She got so excited, she jumped up and yelled, "Hey, It'll," and It'll ran right into her. Boom! But It'll had a full head of steam, and he wasn't going to let that stop him. So he keeps going, and Martha grabs a hold of his jersey and pants, and he's dragging her down the court. He's dribbling, Martha's holding on. He made the shot, hit the layup, and then let go. And I said, that had to be the most embarrassing thing for It'll. No, the most embarrassing thing was the first game of sectional his freshman year. I said, why? It'll was a freshman, he's going to play for the varsity. And said they come out and they had warm-ups, tops and bottoms, and they go through the layups and everything. And coach has them over in the huddle, says, "All right, guys, let's go. Peel your warm-ups off." It'll peels his warm-ups off and runs out onto the court. Coach ran out after him with a towel. It'll had forgot to put his trunks on. He was out there in a jersey, his socks, and a jock strap. So, timeout. So they get It'll dressed and he could play the game. But poor It'll. He was quite a guy.
The It'll name was unrelated to that.
No, nothing. I got a couple kind of longer stories, but first one, I don't know if you guys have ever seen this book. It's called Across the Cimarron. It is a story about a guy named Charles Cimarron, or George Bolds. George Bolds is from Geneva, Indiana, or lived west of here. His father served with the 2nd Indiana Cavalry during the Civil War, lost his arm at the Battle of Nashville. He used to come back here and go squirrel hunting with the kids, and he'd have to find a tree to prop his rifle up to shoot at the squirrel. But George Bolds went west in the 1870s and 1880s. And he was in Kansas, Dodge City, Ingalls, Kansas, Cimarron. He met Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, Doc Holliday, all these guys, and he wrote about it. Now, I'm not going to tell you, he was my Aunt Ina's uncle. John Lindsay would have been his Grant Lindsay was another one of his brothers. I'm not going to say anything about the guy other than, I shouldn't even say, my grandfather and grandmother used to say, "Well, what do you think of George Washington?" He was a damn liar. So we'll just let it go. But they wrote,
Your
but they,
dad said more than that.
yeah, I know, but they wrote this book about it. In fact, they cited that Smithsonian Magazine wrote an article about one of these chapters in this book, and it's about the Battle of Cimarron. It's a true story. What happened was, he's out in Kansas, and he's in a town called Ingalls, Kansas. And Ingalls, Kansas, and the town of Cimarron were in a fight. They both wanted to be the county seat. If you're the county seat, you got a lot more stuff. The railroad would go through, a lot more business would show up and everything. So they have an election, and I guess it happens every so often. There was a controversy about the election, and they were fighting about it. And finally, the Kansas Supreme Court had to rule on it. Well, in the meantime, the man that was elected the county clerk lived in Ingalls, and he wanted all the records brought from the Cimarron courthouse to Ingalls so he could take care of them. So he got the town marshal, a guy named Bill Tilghman, who was a famous marshal in the West, to deputize a bunch of guys and drive from Ingalls in wagons to remove all the courthouse records. So they get in there, and George Bowles is one of them, and a guy named Charlie Reicheldifer. R-E-I-C-H-E-L-D-E-F-F-E-R, Reicheldifer. Pete Reicheldifer was a guy in town, and he always bet, you can't spell my name. I was 4 years old when I learned how to spell Reicheldifer. I never forgot it. So, and that's Pete's dad. But they take off in these wagons. Now, along with them, they had like 4 or 5, there were about 10 guys all together, 10 or 12. And there's a guy with them named James Masterson. James Masterson was Bat Masterson's brother. And Bat Masterson was the most feared gunman in Kansas. Now, we all grew up, when we were kids, we all had cap guns. We all had cowboys. Every other show on television was a Western. When Dad came home with this book, with pictures of Bat Masterson, Wyatt Earp, and we found out that somebody that was kind of halfway related to us, man, that was the best. I took this book to school and showed people. I mean, this is it. So what they do is they get to Cimarron early in the morning, and they go into the courthouse, they break into it, and they start bringing out the files. Well, the citizens of Cimarron see this, and they got a little perturbed, so they grab their guns and come back, and they start shooting at them. About 6 of them are downstairs. Tilghman, 4 of his deputies, Charlie Reicheldifer, and Cimarron George, and they're all wounded. Cimarron George was shot twice in the side, in the leg, other guy. And somehow or another, Charlie Reicheldifer was able to get his team of horses going, and he got them in the wagon and took them back to Ingalls. Well, Bat Masterson's brother and 4 other guys are trapped on the first floor of the courthouse, and bullets are flying. I mean, this is Old West gunfight. The people from Cimarron were able to drive them out of the first floor to the 2nd floor of the building, which led to a standoff because the only way up to the 2nd floor was this real narrow staircase. So every time you poked your head up, somebody from up there would shoot. They tried coming up in through the windows, putting ladders up, and then they were shooting through the windows at them. Well, somebody from Cimarron got the bright idea, hey, that's their floor. So they start firing through the floor up at him that way. So Masterson and all his buddies jump on top of the filing cabinets and a safe and the table there, dodging bullets that way. This went on until early afternoon, when a telegram appeared in the town of Cimarron from Bat Masterson. When they got back to Ingalls, somebody had telephoned or had sent a telegram to Bat Dodge, and he sent a telegram to Cimarron stating that if they didn't let his brother and his friends out of there, he was taking the next train to Cimarron and was going to kill every living thing in town. This is like Charlie Manson telling you that he's coming to take care of you. They negotiated a quick peace and let them go. Now, that's a fairly exciting story, but when you tell a story, there's one point that everybody in town knew about and would always like to remind Charlie about, Pete about. In fact, I was up seeing my mom at the nursing home, and I was telling her I was going to tell you guys this story, and she beat me to the punchline. The punchline was, everybody else was shot in the arm, leg, side, or whatever. Charlie Reckeldacker was shot in the ass. And that's all anybody used to talk about. Poor old Charlie, you know. How, you know, what was he doing? Everybody else is, you know, Charlie was shot in the butt. And they loved reminding Pete of that whenever they'd see him. I got to tell you a quick funeral story. I just remember this. Go out to West Lawn Cemetery, and there's the tombs. You know, some of the tombs, graves have cement tops. Well, there's one, if you look at it real close, it says Shoemaker. If you look at it real close, there's a patch on top of it. I don't know, has anybody ever heard this story? Okay, this guy would have been a cousin to my grandmother. And I don't know what happened, but I think he'd been sick, and somebody walked in the room, and he was sitting in a chair, and they thought he was dead. So the family kind of freaks out, and I don't know, maybe he's just sleeping soundly or something, but they were planning the funeral when he woke up. And it kind of perturbed him, because, you know, they checked him, they couldn't feel a pulse, and they, you know, maybe he's just incredibly sound sick, but it scared the heck out of him. He was worried about being buried prematurely. So when he died, they put one of those concrete things over him, but they put a window in it about this big, and it had a metal flat that you could bring up. And his deal was that you were supposed to go out there a couple of days after the funeral and shine a light down and see if he was alive, because there was a window in his casket. Well, it didn't work because the light reflected and stuff, but still. But for years, kids in town here would go out and flip it up just to see if it would work, you know, shine a flashlight down. And his son, who lived in town, kind of got perturbed about it because, you know, people, hey, I went out to see your dad yesterday, he wasn't there. You know, have you seen your father lately? You know. So he went out and he took some concrete and he put a patch over it. Now, if you want to, you could go out there with a little chisel and just pop that patch right off, and you might want to see if he's still down there. But I talked to guys that had looked down there in the past, they couldn't see a darn thing. So, but I thought I'd better tell you that story. Another story I went to. I saw Judy work. Judy, you may know more about this story than I do. The 1920 Palm Sunday tornado. Everybody remembers the 65 tornado that hit Bern. That tornado was not as big or killed as many people as the 1920 Palm Sunday tornado that came through here. It started in West Liberty, which is in northern Jay County, killed 7 people there, came up the county line and hit, it'd be Judy's grandparents' house. 2 of her aunts were killed. Were they in the barn, or were they out driving cattle?
They were in the barn.
They were in the barn. They were killed. Tate Fields was one of them, was there. I didn't know, I learned very little about it until Tate's funeral, and then Helen and with their dad Perry. They were in the house, it's Palm Sunday. He heard a noise and opened the door, and there's this F4 or F5 tornado right outside. He turned and yelled, "Run!" And then the house exploded, just everywhere. Tate had sand driven up under his eyes. He couldn't see, you know, they had to, his mother was holding Chet. I mean, everybody remember Chet Fields? Great guy. Was holding Chet in her arms, and a rock or something hit her arm and fractured her arm badly and crushed Chet's skull. Chet was just broken. And then the tornado went between Geneva and Sealand, caused a lot of damage, more people were killed, went through the northwest side of the edge of Mercer County, and finally lifted in Van Wert. 17 people were killed in that tornado. They brought all the injured people into Geneva. Doc Hinchman's office was over here, the dark house, beside where my grandmother and everybody was. And they set up an emergency hospital on the lawn between the two houses. My grandfather were living across the street. She came over. They brought blankets, quilts, all sorts of things. And the porch that was that's on the house now is not as big as the one that was originally there. The other one was longer, wider, had a gazebo in it. And they turned that into a makeshift hospital. They brought Chet into the kitchen of my grandparents, and his head was caved in. And Doc Hinchman took his hands and molded it to, and then they took him out and put him down. Mrs. Fields couldn't hold him or anything. She was in bad shape. And they wrapped him in a blanket and laid him on a cot. And this old lady in town looked and said, what's wrong with that baby? And they told her, said, no child should die alone. So she got a rocking chair. And she held Chet all night, rocking. Next morning, they sent a train down from Fort Wayne to pick people up because there were no hospitals. There's no hospital in Jay County. Wells County had the clinic, but it wasn't very big. There's nothing in Adams County, so they took him up to Fort Wayne. Chet was still alive. And they put him on the train. Chet Fields lived a long life. And I think it's because that lady held him.
Rich,
Yeah?
if I hadn't saw it myself, I would never believed it, but when that tornado come through at Glen Grove,
Yeah.
there was a piece of straw in the
Yeah.
tree.
Yeah.
I mean, think of that.
Well,
It's unreal. Like I said, if somebody else told me that, I wouldn't believe it, but
Well,
I saw it.
yeah. They said the one thing that they noticed was the chickens near the area where the tornado came through were all had their feathers off. It either blown them off or they, out of fear, dropped them. But when I think of Chet, I think that's right. And then I think Chet Fields had the most beautiful garden I have ever seen. It was out on Pyle Street in 27, and he had a sign, C. Fields, famous Gold Coast. And I miss that. Chet was a great guy.
I interviewed Chuck yesterday,
Uh,
and she talked about him in the garden.
oh yeah, Chet, Chet was a great guy. Another guy I want to talk about is a guy, everybody knows Gretchen Bumgarner, right? Force of nature. Gretchen was a great person. Alan, her son, her dad, Lester Stuckey, did so much for this town that nobody ever knew about. Lester Stuckey, if it wasn't for Lester Stuckey, they wouldn't have the memorial down here, to be honest with you. He ran the Eastern Indiana Oil Company. They distribute oil from Richmond to Fort Wayne to the west. And Lester, when Dr. Price was going to sell when it moved, and was going to sell the cabin after he bought off the port, Lester organized the Limberlost Conservation Club. And they raised the money to buy that. And they raised enough money that they then bought some farmland south of here, which is where the bird sanctuary is now, tree sanctuary. And the land they didn't develop, they cash rented for that. They used that money to build Rainbow Lake. Lester Stuckey was, he was just this great organizer. Everybody liked him. He was just, and unfortunately Lester got Alzheimer's at a young age, and I never got to meet him. But he was everybody's best friend. And he did just a ton of stuff for the community. And Gretchen continued. I mean, if you needed something done, if you had a committee, you got Gretchen Stuckey to do it, because hell or high water, it was going to get done. And you better do it right. When Stan, her husband, died, she called me up and said, Rich, Stan always liked you. And I said, well, I always liked Stan. She says, can you design a tombstone for him? Yeah. So I did. And it's sitting out at West Lawn Cemetery, Stan Bumgarner. And she liked it. She was good. And how much do I have to pay? I said, you don't have to pay me anything. You guys have been friends of ours for years. Now you have to have something, thank you. Okay, thank you. That was, you know, but that was Gretchen. She was just and Alan, good people. Another thing, Eastern Indiana office was also the end of that was the interurban station. And the interurban was the greatest transportation system we ever had in the state of Indiana. And of course, we screwed it up because everybody stole money from it, embezzled, and didn't repair it. But my dad, when he was in college, when he was a freshman, he could walk out of the house, go to the corner, get on the interurban, take it west through Lynn Grove to Bluffton, get another interurban car, take that through Marion, Gas City, and that. If he left here at 8 o'clock in the morning, he could be in Indianapolis by 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Then he would take another interurban down to Martinsville, jump on a bus. By 6 o'clock, he could be having dinner in Bloomington. Now, this is 1938. I mean, you couldn't have driven in a car like that. It was just a great thing. My friend Ted Gilliam bought a house was near the interurban track in Wells County. The guy that owned it was very prominent. He could walk out of his front door, open the gate, put his hand out, and the interurban would stop, and he could jump on it. If you were a farmer and you had to go someplace, you could go out by the track, wave it down, they'd stop and throw you in, you know. And they ruined it. I hate to fly. I like train, and if we had the interurban now, my dad, Uncle Bill, they were 8, 10 years old. They would jump on the interurban, pay him 50 cents, ride it to Fort Wayne, jump off, go visit my aunt and uncle there, and then come see a movie at the Rialto or the Amboy Theater, and then head back. I mean, it was great. And you know, now the worst train accident they ever had in Adams County or anywhere around here was the wreck at Kingsley. And Terry's great-grandfather, Mr. Duval, I forget how many people were killed.
44.
44.
1910.
1910. But at Kingsland, there's a memorial there when you cross, you know, in Kingsland where the railroad track is, the gate. If you look over, there's a marker for that. But we screwed up, and the Depression pretty much finished it off. But they owned tons of land. They had their own amusement parks. You could take, you know, they'd take you out for amusement rides, you know, you could take that. They had, until the Depression, they were going to take an interurban and run it from Geneva to Salina, Ohio, through Newporton. And they were doing that because so many people would go to the lake over there, they had cabins. So that would have opened up another thing and would have developed that area. But, well, it's gone. I got a question. I had this puzzle. I ran into Bugs Mann, Alan Mann, yesterday, and I gave Alan this. He came within one of it. It's 1962. How many gas stations are there in the town of Geneva? Anybody want to make a guess?
8.
Nope.
About 6, 8.
11. There are 11 gas stations in Geneva. I'll count them off for you. Willard Walker's across the bridge. Feller's gas station. Limberlot's gas station, which is where the pizza, across from where the Pizza King is. Shell station on the corner, where the convenience store is. Standard station beside the Shell station. Pure Oil Gas, which is across the street. Yeah. Louis Parr's. Phillips 66 out on the north end, and Morning Stars, where Maggie sold gas there. 2 to go. Eastern Indiana and Ralph Bailey. 11. How many car dealerships were there in Geneva?
Studebaker.
3. Hofstetter Studebaker. Ralph Bailey sold Kaiser Nash's, and A.G. Briggs and Sons Chevrolet. A.G. Briggs and Sons started selling Chevrolets in 1910. They were the second Chevrolet dealership in the United States. Sold up until 1962. Everybody, why didn't you take it? I was 9 years old. I couldn't. Dad was busy with the bank.
I always thought my dad was buying those little toy cars
Yeah.
they had in the window
They used to give those to us, and we used to blow them up.
there. Yeah.
I wish I had them now. They're worth a ton of money. I'll tell you, my dad, Mom and Dad got married in 1950. John was born in 51. I was born in 53. In 1952, Uncle Rich goes to the Chevrolet dealers meeting. He comes back all excited. Jimmy, you got to buy this car. He said, it's going to be the biggest thing to hit America. He said, you've got to have one, and I want to be, and he said, I can be one of the first guys to get one. He said, I can get maybe one of the first 10 or 15. You've got to buy one of these. So he describes the car to my dad, and Dad says, Uncle Rich, I can't. First of all, it's too expensive. Second of all, I've got a wife, a son, and we're going to have another son. It was a Corvette. He said, it's two-seater, there are going to be 4 of us. He said, don't worry about it, we can work that out. Before I dearly miss Uncle Rich. He was, God, I wasn't going to tell you this story, but Rich and Ina fought like cats and dogs. They would argue all the time in the hardware store. But they never argued in front of us kids. If they, yeah, I mean, they were just, love you. And I was, one Christmas, I'm at the house, and we're decorating the Christmas tree. And we needed bulbs, so we always came to the hardware store. And the hardware store used to stay open until 8, 9 o'clock on Saturday nights. So I come in, and it's just cold and windy, and I get to the hardware, and I open it up, and they had a buzzer, and it was frozen. The buzzer didn't go off. Well, Uncle Rich had an office that was above, and he and Ina are going at it tooth and nail about something. I mean, Ina was only this tall, but she wouldn't back down from anybody. She, and they're going back and forth like this. Well, it's the only time I've ever seen them fight. Everybody in town used to tell us how they fought. This is the first time I actually got to witness it. So I go tiptoeing down the aisle. I get right up behind her, and she turns around and says, oh my God. Now, Richard, you know your uncle and I were just having a family discussion. And he leans over and says, yes, damn it, and she was getting the best of it, too. So she gave me the light bulbs, and I got out of there real fast. Another time, Uncle Richard, he was always getting me in trouble because, I must have been about 8, 9 years old, and it was after school. I went down to Don Stevens to get my hair cut. Well, Pug had retired, but Don was. Believe me, I'm bringing Punk Pontius up real soon. Yeah, we're slogging off. So I go into the barber shop, and there's some older guy in the chair getting his hair cut, and I don't even notice him. I go over and I sit down, and I'm reading comic books. He's talking to Don. I'm not paying any attention. Don finds says, Rich, you're up. So I get up there, and this guy turns around, and I still wasn't looking at him. And he looks and says, who's this fine young man? Don says, this is young Rich Briggs. He starts telling about how I'm going to hell like the rest of my family, and I'm not worth anything, and I'm just screaming at him. Finally look at, and it was Ezra Hawbaker. And now, we'd always been taught, Ezra had his beliefs, and, we were always taught, even if you don't agree with him, don't, be nice to him. He's got his belief, fine. But he's calling me, not swearing, but just telling me that I'm doomed to hell like the rest of my blasphemous family and everything. And then he storms out. And I'm just sitting there going, and Don's going, I don't know. So he cuts my hair. Years later, I'm sitting in my office at the bank, and Ernie Haney comes in. And Ernie knew everything. And we're talking, and he's told me, he said something about Ezra. I tell him the story, and Ernie starts laughing. He said, well, how old were you? I said, I was 9 in 1962, Rich? He said, yeah, how'd you know? I said, I'll tell you what happened. What happened was the hardware store used to stay open until 8, 9 o'clock at night. And at dinner time, Ina didn't want to leave because people would be coming in. She was going to miss the sale. So Rich would go down to the Shamrock, get a cheeseburger and a glass of beer, and then get a cheeseburger for Ina and come back. That way they kept the store running. Well, Hooker Rich has his beer, eats his cheeseburger, has Ina's cheeseburger in a little bag, walks out the front door, and there's Ezra preaching on the street corner. And he's got a crowd. And he looks down and says, now Briggs, he says, how can you do this? He says, you're coming out of a den of iniquity. He says, you're leading people into temptation. He says, you're a leading citizen in this town of Geneva. He says, how could you need to set a better example? He says, don't you know you're going to hell and you're going to roast in hell's fires? And Uncle Rich looks at him and says, well, if I'm going to roast in hell's fires, I need another beer, and turned around and walked out. Well, Uncle Rich didn't have another beer. He just walked through the Shamrock, went to the back door, and walked down the alley and went to the hardware store and gave Ina her cheeseburger. Well, Ezra's out there embarrassed, waiting for Uncle Rich to come out, and he doesn't come out. And he knows he can't go down to the hardware and start yelling at him because Ina is much tougher than Rich ever was. So what happens? 2 days later, I walk into the barber shop, and there's Ezra getting his, I'm the Rich Briggs that got yelled at. Thanks, Uncle Rich.
Ezra had a flat tire, and the guy stopped to help him. And the whole time the guy was changing his tire, Ezra's going around the car saying, thank you, Jesus, thank you, Jesus, thank you, Jesus. And when the guy got the tire changed, he looked at Ezra and he said, I don't know who you think I am. My name isn't Jesus. But I'm the guy that changed your tire.
We used to drive out, and Ezra always had ducks. My grandfather drove out. Ezra lived on 116. He always had wild ducks on this little stream by his house. And we thought that was just so neat. So we found out that Ezra was trapping him, and they couldn't fly off, and the Department of Natural Resources finally came out and told him he couldn't do it anymore. Two things I want to, first of all, I'm ticked off as hell they tore the school down. I wish they could have saved it. That was, you take the school out of town, you just take a big part of it out. We grew up in that school. I mean, geez, I know you were scared, but not to have it there really hurt. My dad graduated in the first class out up there when they built the new one, 1938, I think. Now, the first school in town burned down. It was a wood school, and they built a brick school. I think there've been pictures of it up here. That got too small. And what they did is, when the Depression hit, they had WPA work projects, stuff like that. So they built a new school. And Dad said that they hired some people out of South Bend, a husband, wife, and their kids. They were kind of ran things. They tore down the old school. It was a brick school, but they didn't knock it down. They disassembled it, and they tried to save as many of the bricks as they could. And by cleaning it, Dad said you'd walk by, 7, 8 o'clock at night. Here were these 4 people out there knocking the mortar off a brick. I said, why'd they do that? He said, well, do you remember how solid that school was? I said, yeah. All the interior walls of the old school were built with the exterior walls of the old school. They recycled those bricks and then built it up. That's why that thing was almost indestructible. And I said, well, how did they, when they were building the new school, what happened? How did they do it? Where'd you guys go for school? And it said, well, what they did is they rented out all the top floors of all the buildings here in Geneva. This was like a chemistry room. The Masonic Hall was one. Everything, And I said, what was that like? And it was one. So he said, it was great. He said, all of a sudden, the teacher would say, all right, go to your next class. He said, people would go running down the stairwells. And sometimes you would have to run from here to the Shamrock up there, and you had 5 minutes to do it. And then you'd turn around and you'd have to run back down here an hour later to go to class. They said for about 2 years, that's what they did. I'm gonna kind of wrap things up quick. I mean, there's more, and the other thing, the firemen. My God, the Geneva firemen have done so much for this town. And the one thing I think I remember the most is they used to have dances. Remember on Saturday night, they'd have dances downtown?
Loved them.
What?
Yeah, we did.
Yeah, Ezra would show up with his guitar and sing. He wasn't quite as good as the Beatles, but he was, you know, but the firemen, they've just done so much good stuff for the town. Them in the police department, I miss Preston Pyle. I mean, gee, they go to a basketball game and come out, Preston be parked down there at the Pure Oil Station. Patrol car number 1 flares all over the place directing traffic. Firemen down at this end directing traffic there. It was just a good part of being the town. All right, my Bruce Schlagenhoff story. Okay, first of all, Punk Polonius was a barber here in town. There were 2 barbers when I was growing up. There was the city barber named Floyd. Tell me that name here. That's Floyd Voorhees. He was married to my Aunt Ora Hoskins. They didn't tell anybody until she died. They'd been married for 12 years, but they never told anybody. So, and Punk Pontius. And Bruce used to hang out at Punk's barber shop a lot. A lot of guys hung out at Punk's barber shop. I mean, it was a great, if you wanted to have an argument, you wanted to have a fight or something, you went down to Punk's barber shop. Well, Punk had a bicycle. You guys have probably heard this story. He had a bicycle. And it's not like bikes, you know, it didn't have a coaster brake where you could, you know, push back on it and slow down. It had handbrakes. Well, the handbrakes were gone. There were no brake, there's nothing there. It was just a bicycle. If you tried to use the coaster brake, it'd just sit there and spin, you know. So they got an argument, and the argument was how safe that bike was. And Bruce was a darn good athlete. Not very big, wiry, and afraid of nothing. Bruce was a steeplejack. Ronnie Rose told me they were working on the cathedral at Fort Wayne, and Lincoln Life had secretaries, and they were just down the street, and they'd come out on their lunch hour. And Bruce, you know, good-looking women, Bruce was showing off. So he grabbed a rope and tried climbing to the top of the steeple, like you do in gym class. Usually they hoist. He got about 30, 40 feet up in the air, and Bruce got tired. So he tried to loop the rope around his leg to give him a little, he missed, and he went down. And the only thing that saved him was that Bruce was kind of sloppy, and he left his ropes out on the lawn, and the priest had thrown him up on the concrete steps, and Bruce hit this pile of ropes straight on. Didn't kill him, but sure beat the heck out of him. He had broken bones, bruises, all sorts of contusions. And this is right around, just before Halloween. And everybody tells me, no, Bruce is drunk. If Bruce lives, he's going to be paralyzed for the rest of his life and everything. Oh, it's just terrible. Well, they're having the firemen are having the parade for the 4th of July. And all of a sudden, here comes this car. It was a convertible. And they've got Bruce propped up in the back seat with casts on his arms and a thing down it, and his hands out like this, and he's doing the Queen Elizabeth wave. Next thing, a brace, and everybody, well, Bruce ain't gonna die, you know, by then. But he and Punk got in this argument, and Bruce said, I can ride that bicycle anywhere. I'm not afraid of anything. So Punk says, all right. He says, you see that stairway? Yeah. He says, take it up to the 2nd floor and ride it down to the sidewalk. Bruce says, no problem. So he lugs the bicycle up to the top of the stairway. Bruce, Punk looks up and says, you ready, Bruce? Ready. And Bruce comes down the stairway. Bum, 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 bum. He can't break it. If he gets off or if he tries to, he's going to lose the bet. He gets about 2 feet from the sidewalk. He's still upright. He's still heading down at full speed. Punk slammed the door shut. Bam! Boom! Crash. You know, they open the door. The bicycle, the front wheel is just like a figure 8 crush. handlebars are snapped in half, the bike's frame is twisted. Bruce has got a big knot on his head, he's bleeding from his nose, and he's laying there, you know, you can't tell where the bike starts and Bruce ends, you know, it's just, and he looks at me and goes, "Why?" And Punk says, "I saw a car coming down the street and I figured he was going to hit you when you got out there, so I slammed the door to save your life." That's my Bruce Slug. Sure.
That's a true story.
Yes. I have had more people.
Anybody else but me.
Oh, yeah. One time, Harold Long told me that, like I said, Bruce was a good athlete. And I hate telling these stories because it really ticks the shop off. But they were playing Burn-In baseball. And they hadn't beaten it for a couple of years. And it was the last of the ninth. Burn had runners on second and third, 2 outs, and some guy from Burn hit a lazy fly ball out to Bruce. Bruce comes running in, pats his glove, he puts it up, and Punk's in the bleachers yells, "Don't miss it, Bruce!" And Bruce turns his head, went right over the 2-run score. They lost the game. Harold says, "I could have killed him." Another time, Punk took Bruce down to a baseball game. Punk's a big Cubs fan, and they went down to Crosley Field to see the club. See the Cubs play the Reds, and Bruce wasn't very old, and Punk's buying hot dogs, ice cream, pop, and everything. And about the 5th inning, Bruce throws up, you know. And this lady says, "If that was my son, I wouldn't treat him like that." And Punk says, "He wasn't my son, that's why I was treating him like that." You guys have any questions? I've been talking for an hour.
I heard that Bruce came in and Punk asked him what his mother was doing. He said she's upstairs baking cookies for a club meeting, but she went to the store. And Punk said, "You know, your mother told me she was going to bring a plate of cookies down for the guys." And Bruce said, "Well, I'll just go up. He doesn't bring them down now, then she won't have to." And Punk sat in the front window, and Mom comes home and sees her cookies in the front window.
You see, Punk, one time they lived above Punk's farm, so there's a nice apartment up there.
That was one of them.
Yeah, and it was Bruce, it was Pat, Chubb, Victorine. Her real first name isn't Victorine, it's Alice Victorine. And what was it? There are 3 sisters. Yeah. Yeah, and she just passed away recently too. And Bruce, and those girls were chasing Bruce. Harold was working somewhere, and Punk said you could hear him run from one side of the room to the other, back and forth, back and forth, back. Boom! They chased him through the door. He went over the edge of the fire escape and hit in a trash can. It was on the ground. Didn't hurt him. You couldn't hurt Bruce Logan. I miss Bruce. He was past a character. He was a legend. He brought a golfer down. We were having a golf tournament. He brought a golfer down. The guy was a professional golfer. He had one arm, and he won all sorts of trophies as a one-arm golfer. And Bruce had this guy. He said, "We're going to kill you guys. We're going to win this tournament." The thing is, Bruce sat there and fed the guy beer all morning, and he was so drunk he couldn't play golf. Bruce, the one-arm golfer. Anybody got any questions? Anybody want to say anything? I mean, I think I've talked long enough. I've got a bunch of stories like that. There's a bunch of stories I didn't tell you.
You should write a book.
Yes, this is wonderful.
Okay.
Hey, Rich, can you just give us a real brief history of the golf course, when it started?
The golf course started at about, the lake opened about 62. Golf course opened probably about 64. First pro we had out there, the guy designed was a guy named Hank Culp. He and his wife, they built 9 holes. And it was basically built by just labor here in town. The Long Boys had their bulldozer. I know your dad, Wendell worked out there.
Wendell had the course record for a while.
Yeah, Wendell had the course. All the tile, Myron and Venus Simmons donated all the tile that they used to tile.
Reason.
Yeah, Cirilla Reason worked out there. The clubhouse was a restaurant here in town, the Hoosier House, and they moved it out there for the clubhouse. That's where across from Louis Pars. I mean, I remember when we used to have to go out there and look for grass to play on. You know, if you could find a club, we played winter rules, you know,
Yeah.
you find something you hit on. But it was all the conservation club, basically. Some guys, Bern and Geneva businessmen were looking to build one. And the conservation says, we've got the land. They bought the land off of Harold Long. That was the old Voorhees farm. And took them about 2 years, and they got the whole thing put together. And
So the course was an afterthought of after the lake was done.
yes, yes.
Yeah.
In fact, one of the interesting things about the lake, there's never supposed to be a road on the dam. The road was supposed to end there, but the school was having trouble because they have to back the bus and go in. So they said, well, let's try it. They put a road there. It's been there ever since.
You got your best scores that first year because you hit the ball and it hit the clay and bounced all the way down to the hole.
One time, this is a good Cedric Hardy story. Cedric and Dad were tree nuts. And Cedric wanted to have the most farther north stand of bald cypress in the United States. The bald cypress wouldn't grow any farther. They're a southern tree, and there's one stand in a sheltered valley near Columbus, Ohio. But there's almost nothing in Ohio south, in Indiana. Southern Indiana had some, but once you got past, well, when we built the addition on the golf course, we had to have the Department of Natural Resources come in and do a tree survey, that we had to plant certain trees and stuff. So we're going, like, of course, Dad over the year planted every tree that God made out of the golf course because he could. And we're standing there and going over this list of trees with the DNR guys, and the guy goes, oh, bald cypress. He says, well, we can mark that one off. And the guy that was with us says, no, you can't. I said, why? Bald cypress don't grow here. He says, what do you call that? They're about, I think, 9 or 10 bald cypress at the time, 30 feet tall, sitting out the golf course. And the guy, how the hell did you guys pull that off? You know, you told us we couldn't do it, we did it. And they're still there. And Buck and Dad, for years, would go out and plant in the wetlands at the golf course, plant bald cypress seedlings. There are bald cypress trees going there now. So, but the golf course was, I mean, spent a lot of time having fun out there. Anybody else? I've got, I hate to say it, but I've got a lot more stories. I am going to have to, my granddaughter, oldest granddaughter, she wants to be an author. And when I go down now, she said, tell me a Briggs story. So I've been writing them down. And maybe she'll turn them into a book.
Rich, my uncle, Romeo Mill,
Yeah.
started selling Chevrolets,
Yeah,
1960 models.
right.
Dad got the first one in late '59.
Yeah.
Was there a direct relationship between
Yes.
retirement of Briggs Chevrolet? and
We sold out to
Leakey
Romeo Mill.
Motors? Okay.
They took it over then. Tony and all of them. Darn Lee. But no, yeah, Uncle
We
Rich.
were related as, so we had.
Yeah, yeah. It always amazed me that John Pyle's grandfathers were Preston Pyle and Ezra Hawbaker. If there were two totally dissimilar people in the world, Preston was such a great guy. I mean, there was no crime in Geneva when Preston was here. I don't know what. I still remember he used to wear this kind of fur hat, the badge on it, and he had a black coat and everything. And he drove a patrol car and everyone. And he always had a big nightstick. And every morning he was there at the crossing, as the kids crossed. And every night he was there to help you go home.
Everybody loved me.
Oh, yeah. And we haven't had always. No, I wasn't going to tell this story, but I guess I will. Okay. We've had really good police officers in Geneva, but every so often we get one that just doesn't quite meet. Yeah.
This is the grandson.
Oh, okay. Oh, man. They sent me, John Pyle, sent me the Pyle family history to read. And I sent it back. He said, oh, we were a pig farm. I said, yeah, but John, it's good. So, but after Preston retired, I think Larry Blumwalker was this year, then they hired this guy, Ben Eide, General Ben Eide. And Ben was a nice guy, but Ben should never have been a police officer. And one night, the worst time of year when we were kids to be around harvest. First of all, you learn how to put up with the smell of the candy factory, and eventually you get to where you can tell what they're making by the smell. This other thing is that Central Soya, every Tom, Dick, and Harry elevator in Indiana would send their stuff up there, and 27 was a big route for Southern. And those trucks were coming through here 24/7 at 90 miles an hour through town. I mean, because they were getting paid by the load or something. So one night, I think this is 1970, a lady down in Bryant, her name was Jerry Crow. If you guys knew Jerry, very nice lady. She's coming up Geneva to see somebody. She was on the west side of town. The worst place in the world to try and pass anybody is Highway 27 between Bryant and Geneva. Narrow, 2-lane, if there's traffic coming the other way, you're not gonna get through. She's coming north, and some semi-driver with a full load of soybeans comes roaring up behind her about 90 miles an hour. Well, she can't get over, he can't pass her, so he just stays right on her tail. They come through town, they get up to Shackley Street. Jerry puts on her turn signal to make the turn. Semi-driver figures, hey, she's turning, I'm gonna go in the left lane, and I'll go around her. Well, she signaled she was turning right, but she was turning left. Semi hits her and just crushes the car, shoves it into the schoolyard. And if you remember how the schoolyard was, it was flat and then it kind of go up, just burrowed in there like a shovel or something. There was a red oak tree, splintered that, just shattered it. Her car is pinned underneath the cab of the semi. All the beans from the back have spilled out on the road. You're ankle deep in soybeans. Everything, police come, county cops, state cops, they come, somebody calls, they come rush in. The firemen bring a tanker down because, the fuel oil and stuff. And here's poor Mrs. Probst stuck underneath this car, and all the firemen and cops, they're trying to pry the door. They didn't have jaws of life back then. It was just crowbars and everything, and they're trying to pry to get her out. Hardee's didn't have their ambulance at the time. They stopped that, but Jaegers was down here with their ambulance. And they're flares and all sorts of, it's just madness, And down the street at the Shamrock is sitting Ben Ide, the town marshal, relaxing. And somebody walks in and says, hey, Ben, why aren't you at the wreck? And Ben goes, what wreck? And they said, the wreck down on 27. So Ben gets out, he looks down, he sees all the lights and smoke and everything. And he gets in patrol car number 1, and he takes off going down the street. I hate to say it, but I was there. I was standing, we'd been in town, and we were sitting on the steps of the Methodist church on the north end, a bunch of us kids. They finally told us to get out because we weren't helping, but here comes Ben in the patrol car. He comes to the intersection, and he applies his brakes. Well, there's soybeans, so Ben just goes sliding through. About halfway through, he gets out, and there are flares, there's lights, there's a semi almost in the school, a car underneath, people pounding on it, and Ben looks around and says, all right, where's the wreck? So they took Ben and they put him in the car, and they said, you monitored the radio. And we had a new police chief about a year later. And Ben he was a nice guy. He just should never have been the town marshal. I've been here too long.
Eric,
Yeah.
I don't know if you can tell this story that you told me one time before. If you don't use any names,
Okay.
it involved the poison wine.
Oh, okay. What happened was, when Dad was a kid, there was a couple in town, and first of all, I can remember walking out, like, at Herman's house, that they had grapevines all over the place, and people in town made wine. It's prohibition, you know, people made their own beer, wine, and if you went out to Trinity, you could get all the whiskey you wanted to, I guess. So, but, you know, and everybody's always got stories about making beer, so I mean, blowing up in the kitchen, and, but this couple and their next door neighbor were playing cards on Saturday night, and the neighbor brought some wine, and the husband and wife had some wine, and they were sitting there, and somehow or another the wine was poisoned, and they were dying. So somehow they got a hold. They brought them down to Doc Kinchman's house in the front lawn, and Dad said, you know, here, I think Dad said he was about 10. He says, here are these 3 people laying out in front of Doc Kinchman's house, and Doc's got a stomach pump, trying to get the poisoned wine out of them, you know, with all the town sitting around the sidewalk watching. Well, and what kind of complicates it is not only were they pumped or something, but everybody in town knew that the wife was running around with the neighbor. So the problem was, did the husband poison the neighbor and his wife to kill him? Did the wife poison the husband? They didn't know who poisoned who. The neighbor died. The husband and wife survived. No charges were filed because they couldn't figure out who brought the wine. Because everybody, I mean, you could go in and you could buy corks and stuff and caps to kept the wine at the hardware store. And everybody recycled bottles. I always figured somebody got a hold of a bottle that had some strychnine or something in it, and they used it, didn't clean it out well. But Dad said, well, you know, the way they figured it, well, if they didn't know who did the poisoning, that probably kept him more honest, because he didn't know if she was going to poison him again or if he was going to poison her again. Dad said, you know, there are all these people standing outside the line, you know. The other, Doc Kinchman was always good for stories. My Uncle Bill, Dad was never supposed to run the bank. His older brother Bill was going to run the bank. And Bill fell in love with a girl named Lois in college, and she was from Cleveland, and she did not want to live in Geneva. I mean, she wouldn't have fit in here. So Bill, he's just out of the Army, and he brought her back here, and Bill said, and even Lois told me the story, Ina told me the story. They had a great visit, and on the way back, they were walking back from the hardware store to my grandparents. Lois said, Bill, he said, I think I can live here in Geneva. And Bill said, you know, it's just great. He was going to run the bank, you know. They get in front of Doc Kinchman, and a car comes pulling up. Some guy comes running out of the car, opens the passenger side, and drags another guy out, and he's been shot in the face with a shotgun, just blood and everything. Drags him into Doc Kinchman's. And about that time, I think Mr. Hershey was the marshal. He comes roaring up. He draws his gun out. He runs in, grabs the driver, and drags him out of Doc Kinchman's office. And the guy's screaming, hey, if I was trying to kill him, I wouldn't have brought him to the doctors. And Mr. Hershey threw him in there and took off with it. And Bill said, I turned and I looked at Lois. He said, I knew I was moving to Cleveland. You know, when I was first started, I'll finish up with this. My daughters and son-in-law said, all you're going to do is talk about your family and about all the wonderful stuff your family's done. And I said, no, the only reason I have to talk about my family is that this is stuff we discussed. And it's stuff that I grew up with. And I said, you know, the only reason I know this stuff is we've been here for 5 generations. Here, I'll read something real quick. This guy, French Quinn, who's a historian, wrote this. And he wrote about the town of Geneva, and it's right after the oil boom. He says, but Limberlost, Geneva was still there and going strong with the Drews, Hales, Briggses, Judays, and Butchers. I'm the only one that's still here. The rest of them are all gone. And that's the only reason I know these stories.
Can I tell you
Yeah.
a quick one
Yeah,
about
well,
how great it was to grow up here? I was riding my bike, and I can't remember the street name, it was the one to the south of
Okay.
Main Street.
Shackman.
Riding my bike along, and I have an accident. I'm bloodied, and this guy pulls up in his car, and he gets out, and he goes, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah." And he goes, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Melvin's girl." And he knew who I was, and he took me home. All I had to say was my dad's name, his
Yeah.
first name. And, you know, and it's just the way it was brought up. Everybody knew everybody else. And,
Well, you've heard this story. First of all, when Dad went in the Army, he was at Fort Dix in New Jersey, I think. And it was 1943. And in the Army, they had tents where everybody stayed in, you know, big ones. They had 10, 20 guys in everybody. Every day, Dad would walk out, and there was this guy who was coming out, usually coming out about the same time. They kind of nodded at each other. You know. One day, they're in the shower, you know, a bunch of guys in the shower. And Dad looks over, and this guy's got a big scar on his chest, a burn scar. And Dad looks at him and says, "Where are you from?" Or he said, "Where'd you get that scar?" He said, "Well, when I was a kid, I was messing around in the kitchen. My mom was boiling some water to do the wash." And he said, "I hit that, and it scalded me across there." And Dad looks at him, "Where are you from?" He said, "Geneva, Indiana." "Where are you from?" He said, "I'm from Geneva." It was Otis Bucky. They graduated from high school together, but they hadn't seen each other for about 4 years, and Otis had grown about this much, and Dad had lost a bunch of weight. Now, the other thing, and you know this story, Dad was in France. He was a quartermaster. He's on the docks one day. They would have to go there and unload ships, and Dad would send it to the warehouse or whatever. Here's some guy yelling his name from a ship. And he looks up, and there's Melvin Bixler. Jimmy, Melvin. So Dad goes to see Melvin, but Melvin was restricted to the ship. I think they had to unload the ship before Melvin could get off. And Melvin was in the Marines, Navy, but he was on a gunnery crew. And because they're still having air raids and stuff, you know, from the Germans, he had to stay there to defend the ship. So he could only come halfway down the gangplank, and Dad could only go halfway up the gangplank. So they were there talking, and Melvin couldn't. He said, "We're here in port in France." He says, "We can't get into town to get anything or do anything." And Dad says, "Well, I'm the supply officer. What do you need?" So Melvin made a list and went and collected money from all the guys in the ship and gave it to Dad on the gangplank. And then Dad went down into town to the PX, to the bar or whatever, loaded up with all the stuff they needed and brought it back. So they traded goods, gave Dad the cash to pay for it, Melvin got all the other stuff. They did that for about 3 or 4 days before they could finally get off. And Dad said, "You know, it's great." He said, "First of all, I ran into somebody from home. We had a great time." And he said, "I helped Melvin out because they couldn't get anything brought to the ship. They were restricted on what, because they didn't know if somebody would put a bomb in a pineapple or something and send on." But he said, "I was able, because I was the supply officer, I could get Melvin all the stuff."
Made your dad a pretty popular guy.
Oh yeah, well Melvin was popular anyway. Herman was in the submarines and Melvin was on surface, and they arranged to meet in San Francisco. It's the only time they hadn't seen each other for years, and they missed each other by a half an hour.
yeah.
Yeah, they were supposed to meet, and Melvin's ship got in, left early, and Herman missed him, and they didn't see each other till the end. I like it when your dad and mom got married and Herman sold their car.
He wrecked it.
Yeah, he wrecked it. Melvin said he wrecked it, but that was good. So your mom and dad couldn't go anywhere on the honeymoon.
All right, let's everybody give Rich a really big round.
I guess I'm going to be doing this again at the memorial in September sometime. I have to work the details out.
At the Limberlost?
At Limberlost. So,
Limberlost.
but I am going to start writing all this stuff down because
Was it recorded today?
yeah.
Yeah, it's actually recorded today.